then we developed ideal plans. These are taking the building blocks, working with the direct users like the sheriff and the the juvenile transition center. What makes sense where, so we built those blocks. And then we studied 3 different sites, and on those 3 different sites, we actually did 12 different options. You may not have known this, but we created 12 different designs for these 3 sites that we look at. So today we're just going to kind of summarize this pretty quickly. There we are in action. Again, we had a lot greater participation. I think there was a great share of ideas. We learned a lot about how you operate buildings, how you operate your programs yesterday, just by talking about what should be where. I mean, so we learned a lot from you guys yesterday, which has been very helpful. So we did our program and we find it. The jail right now, as we mentioned, we're over $50,000 or 50,000 square feet less than what the target study was. We took out another 1,000 square foot because of the remainders and another program left in there. So right now we're about 155,000 square feet versus the 208 from the previous study in 2007. On the juvenile center, the program didn't change a lot. We're down about 39,000 square feet. And again, we're about 10,000, 12,000 square feet less than the Carter Mobile study, about 10,000 square feet less. Combined, we're about 192,000 square feet for both the juvenile and the jail. And again, the previous study was about 257,000 square feet, so we're less than where 2007 was. And I think a lot of it was taking a harder look at your mission statement, making modifications specifically on the juvenile transition center. We didn't need as much detention. We're focused more on the day treatment type things. And also on the jail, we went back and looked at all the data. We're about 506 rated beds, and then we have another 22 beds, so we're 528. The Carter Global study was about 788. So we're about 200 beds less than what was previously recommended. So those things led to reduction in space. Now we did add more program space, so it's kind of give and take, but overall we're quite as small as what we were. Okay, so we built these ideal models. And you'll see these coming up throughout the day. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because we've actually diagrammed this layout in a little bit more detail as far as what's secured, what isn't secured, how the parking might work, staff entrance, things like that. So we built an ideal model for the jail. We built one for the juvenile center. And again, we'll go into a little more detail. And then we built one for the combined plan. It also shows future expansion, because in all these studies, we looked at how are we going to expand the building, because we don't want you to be in the same spot 10 years from now, trying to figure out, I didn't think far enough ahead, I didn't plan. So everything we do when we study the sites, when we study these buildings, we want to make sure that we've got expansion opportunities in mind. Okay, so we looked at basically 3 different sites. This is the Hall of Justice right here in the center. We looked at 3 different sites. And they're listed up here: the Business Park North, BL Apple Avenue, and 414 West Broadway. 414 West Broadway is actually the closest one, with the Muskegon Business Park North the furthest away, and then we have the BL Apple, which again is a pretty good distance. To put it in perspective, this is about 6-8 miles or so. This is 5-6 miles, and this is about 2-3 miles. So we're closer to, with Site C, and we'll go a little bit more, we're closer to the service area that you're actually providing, as well as the program providers and people assisted through the programs with this option C. And then as we get further out or further away, it's harder for people to get to the programs and things of that nature. So looking at the Business Park North, one thing we came to very early on is that this infrastructure through the site was somewhat limiting, especially when we started studying the combined option. And I'm going to throw another term at you that we used last night, is we have co-locate. So when we co-locate on the same site, we can potentially take advantage of reduction of space and reusing or using staff or sharing staff between the buildings, like the nurse or the medical or things like that. So there's benefits to having co-location that we don't necessarily need to put everybody in the same building, but if we're on the same site, we could benefit from that. For instance, we could have the meals prepared by the sheriff and then taken over to the juvenile center. That's one option if we can get the dietary concerns or the dietary needs of the juveniles or requirements of juveniles met in the same scenario. So in that option, we looked at a new jail, we looked at a transition center, we looked at co-locate, and we couldn't do combine because it just became prohibitive because of that road that I mentioned. We'd have to take out the road, all the infrastructure, because it just wasn't wide enough. The shape of the space didn't work very well. So we only looked at 3 options on this one. So the jail, again, using your ideal plan, laid out pretty nicely, staff parking over here, public parking, public entrance there, intake and processing. Housing back here, we have the medical and support services and then future expansion. So the jail worked out pretty nice on that site. Now, in each one of these slides, we've defined advantages and disadvantages for it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but for instance, in this one of the major problems or one of the major issues we have is about $40,000 an acre. Now, you'll find out that's more than 5 times more than any other option we had available. Plus, it's further away from where, for instance, the juvenile center, and the further away you get from the courthouse and or from the Hall of Justice, you've got more time as far as the sheriff and transporting prisoners to court and things like that. So the closer it is, the better for both entities, I think. And there were some positive things. We had utilities right at the site. We're investing in the community redevelopment. So we have vacant property. We're actually building something positive. But the downside is that you're eliminating some opportunities on that land for other developers that may actually improve your tax base. You won't be paying taxes, a private developer or some entity that comes in there would be. So sometimes you look at the land as, okay, I've taken my opportunity to potentially generate more revenue through taxes by developing an entity on there that doesn't pay taxes. So each one of these has advantages and disadvantages. We'll just kind of highlight them, and all of this will be available in our final report. Okay, then we looked at option 2, we looked at just the juvenile center over on this side, and again, we could very easily do that. We could expand in both directions. We could expand this way, we could expand parking. And it's got good visibility of the street. Once again, advantages and disadvantages. So one of the things we've heard a lot, and you'll see this when we talk about those remote sites that aren't as close to downtown, is the distance from central service agencies, support programs, and service area. That's where we had a diagram made available to us from you folks that showed this is where a lot of our kids are. Okay, this is where a lot of our kids are. We maybe ought to be next to where a lot of our kids are. And we talked about being on a bus route, which we did some of that. And the other thing that came up, and Paul brought this up, is that and this comes up more later when we talk about 414, is that sometimes when you get in more of an urban environment, it becomes a potential for delinquency from the kids. If they're distracted by what's around them, and they may leave and never come back kind of thing. Now that doesn't come in here as much, but it does when we talk 414. And then it did have some advantages. Again, the advantages to this were very separate, very similar to that. But when we're separate, there was a lot of concern expressed about being associated with the jail and the stigma associated with being right by the jail and being seen as more of a detention than a transition type center. So when we co-locate, one of the things we did is we tried to get them as far apart as we can, which the preferred option, we have them pretty far apart, but they can still take advantage of these services. They could be shared, the staff could be shared. And then we looked at co-location on the same site, taking advantage of this infrastructure is in place, and that's one of the benefits of this, is it's fairly clean. We have good infrastructure in place, we have utilities all the way around it, and they could potentially have their own identity even though they're here, but since they're separated from the street, it doesn't look like they're all kind of mashed together. So we looked at co-location, and we did not look at, again, we didn't look at the combined because of that street and the cost, and it was just prohibitive. Okay, the next thing we did is we looked at the VL Apple property, and this is kind of weird, and it took us a while to sort this out. There's a road that comes in here. The only thing we have is right of way, basically. We'll strip of property and right away here, and then we have this property, and then there's a little bit over in here, if I understand right.
No, it goes right straight up.
It's just this property. Now it's 19 acres, right? It's 19 acres, but the problem is a lot of the 19 acres is in water. So the cost for this land was about $9,000 an acre. So it was a little higher, but the usability of it, when you consider that property, about half of that is water. So you're paying $9,000 an acre for a bunch of water. So when we started to look at this in terms of a jail, it just would not fit in any way, shape, or form unless we could put part of it floating back here. Maybe we could float the detention wings or something like that. So we quickly abandoned that. We abandoned the co-location. We had to abandon the combined building. We just looked at this in terms of the juvenile center. We just looked at that one. So we put the juvenile center back here. There was some concerns expressed about being next to a pond. You know, what if people would drown? You have to spend money on fences. We have to build that road all the way back there. We have to take the utilities all the way back there. We need street visibility. Now, the good thing is that you're certainly remote from the potential delinquency associated with being in an urban environment. The bad news is that you don't have any visibility. I think potentially could be on a bus route, but you're not currently on a bus route, so it's tough to get to. So that site kind of came pretty low on the list. I would say that was probably the least favorite of what we studied. Okay, then we looked at Broadway. Now Broadway, 414 West Broadway, it comes up here, basically does this, comes down around and like this. So again, it's about 20 acres, but this was the most cost-effective property that there was. It was about $7,000 an acre. It was about 20 acres, so you're looking at about $150,000 for the property. Now, as we mentioned, this is an old image. This has actually all been torn down. And there were some concerns maybe it's a brownfield site. So Chad's looking into that today. We're going to track it down. And the other thing is we didn't really know much about this railroad. From the pictures, it appears to be abandoned from the aerial images, because typically you would see a profound road bed in this area. Rail bed, the grade with the gravel, all that stuff. So we heard varying opinions on, yeah, there's a train once a day, north of Van, so we're going to check into that. But when we laid it out, we made provisions as if that isn't available. If it is available, all of these options we did actually are enhanced a little bit, but they certainly fit within the context. Now, we were able to study everything on this site, and we studied a bunch of everything on this site. We studied just the jail, we studied just the juvenile center in a couple different locations, we studied the co-locate in 3 different options, jail going north-south, east-west, that kind of thing, and then we studied the combined along the Broadway Avenue. So this would be just the jail. Again, we could lay out what we wanted to accomplish with this, our ideal model, and we could do future expansion. And we even had room up here that we could either not acquire that property, subdivide it, or it could be something else in the future. Again, advantages and disadvantages. We're about $7,500 an acre, but we're only 3 miles or so away from the county building, the Hall of Justice, so we're pretty close. And then we looked at the jail going east-west along Broadway. So Broadway's down in here, and this is Temple along this side. So we looked at it going east-west. Again, we had plenty of room for future expansion. Sallyport down here, staff circulation. We could put public out front. So we could manage this site in a way that's safe for both the public, the staff, and everybody else involved in the building. Again, advantages and disadvantages for that option. Then we looked at the juvenile center. Now, the juvenile center could be anywhere on this site. If it's alone, it could be anywhere. It could be at the corner of Broadway and Temple, which is where we did kind of define an option would be. High visibility, it's on a bus route, it's right central to where your services are, it's central to where a lot of the kids are that you're treating. So you get the families more involved because they're close to the center. So it had a lot of opportunity on this site. Again, advantages and disadvantages. These are very similar to the jail. Now, in this case, if it was a standalone juvenile center in that location, you wouldn't have the stigma of the jail and those kind of things. Okay, then we looked at it on the north side of the property. And again, this is that railroad that goes along here. And this was Sherman Road or Sherman Street up on the north side. So the south is up, south is down this way, north is towards the bottom. Back. What we're concerned about is if this is an active rail, we want to make sure we manage sound, because we don't want kids being woke up in the middle of the night and things like that. We do public parking here, main entranceway, there's a lot of our support, attention, treatment side, shared resources in the center. Advantages and disadvantages, again, very similar to if it was at the corner of Broadway and Temple. And then we looked at them together, and we can easily expand both of these options. Again, expansion for detention here, expansion for the juvenile center in both directions, basically all directions. They would be close to each other, but we would treat this in such a manner that they become two different entities. The way you design the building, the way you design the jail and what it looks like, and the way you design the juvenile center is completely opposite. The mission statements are different, and the architecture wants to augment the goals of your mission statement. So the buildings would look completely different even though they're next to each other, and there's ways that we can manage this separation so that they become even more independent. So advantages and disadvantages. And disadvantages, again, we had this thing that we talked about may contribute to delinquency associated with an urban environment, potential stigma associated with juvenile adjacency, and the tax base and things like that, that we're taking property that could be redeveloped to generate tax revenue and turning it into a non-revenue generating activity. Okay. So then we looked at combined north-south, and we put the juvenile center on the north side, the jail to the south. So they had completely different entrances, but since they're co-located, we potentially could reduce some square footage, we could share some staff resources, things like that. So it could be a little more cost-effective project. Each one would have a separate identity, and then we treat this separation between the two buildings in such a manner that they appear to be even more separate than what, even though they're on the same site, they become two different entities. Advantages and disadvantages very similar to the one we just discussed. Hey, this was our preferred option. Yesterday we kind of took a vote at the end of the day. We said, okay, we looked at all this stuff. What do you guys think? We call this option 3C. They're 414 West Broadway. So we created more separation between the jail and juvenile, but they're co-located, so we can take advantage of it. We have separate entrance points. One potentially off Temple for the public. We still have full control of the jail as far as this is public side, this is secure side. We have the juvenile center, both have a planning room for expansion. Again, these are future cell pods. These would be the ones initially planned. So everyone thought, hey, maybe that's not a bad idea. Let's explore that a little bit more. So we developed these plans with a little more detail, the bubble diagrams that we did yesterday. And on the jail, for instance, we're saying, okay, let's put staff parking here, public parking here. This is staff entrance, this is public entrance. We have our future program that we talked about, maybe even designing as an alternate, and this could be a work release component or whatever it might be, but it might give the jail a little more opportunity to do alternate programs rather than just incarceration, which I think is something that they're interested in doing as well. Sally Port down here, so I've got public basically on this side. I've got all of my controlled circulation here, service yard back there, kitchen, and some of my support areas, medical. I've got my staff for the corrections, and then administration staff, support services, EMA, patrol, detectives, and all those kind of folks kind of down in this area. So I've got a really good separation between my detention component, my office component, my staff area, my public area. So it seemed to work out pretty well. And then these are future expansion. So intake and processing, we just keep adding on. And I think you can only add 2 more pods, but we're not going to be alive to worry about that. Hopefully we won't be back here in 20 years dealing with that issue. Okay, on the juvenile center, we kind of looked at it the same way. Now, we know there is or is not an active rail there, so if there is, we potentially could do berming. When you're controlling decibels from a train, you need density. Putting in pine trees and things like that won't do a thing. We need things like berming, sound control walls, other type of things. But we know that if it is active, we need to do something there. We have staff parking here, public parking, public lobby, this is administration. We have central intake and assessment and detention over on this side. We have visitation and things like that on that side. What you see, the hatched area is kind of like controlled circulation. So for instance, in this area, there's also classrooms and things like that, plus a cafeteria, and then the gymnasium may be shared. So we can control this circulation from detention to keep it separate from the treatment side and still allow access to the same type of spaces. Future expansion for housing, future expansion for the treatment housing, future expansion of program spaces so we can grow. Then we have outdoor recreation areas on each side that we can control through landscaping, give some privacy, but still be able to control their movements and activities and things like that to the degree that we need to. So here's kind of your ideal plan with a little more diagram on it and kind of explaining how some of the things might work. All right, so we started looking at this in terms of the 3D model. Stephen did a great job last night kind of putting some detail in this. Again, this is the ideal model. Now, we mentioned that maybe we want to put staff parking over on this side and public parking there, but in general, it kind of gives you an idea if they're on the same campus, what we may be able to do. Future pods, we're saying that we're going to create something in here to separate it, but kitchen here, we have a warming kitchen there, we may have a road that connects the two together. So if they do share staff, they do share some resources, we've got access way between the two. Separate entrance for juvenile, separate entrance for jail on this opposite side. And again, we're controlling the centerpiece of it. Another view of it, this would be looking southeast. Juvenile center on this side, jail on the opposite side. This is Broadway, Sherman, Temple down here. Looking at it from the north, or looking southwest, southwest, this would be the back of the jail. So this is kind of a service support area, public side, public side. Another direction, this is just looking kind of northwest. And just a plan view of how campus might lay out. Again, we've got plenty of separation here that we can manage, separate entrance points, public, private, secure sides, things of that nature. So Stephen's got a 3D model that you can pan around here if you guys want to see a specific view or a different angle. Now what we'll do is a lot of what you see here will apply to the preferred options that we select today, so it helps people visualize how this program might work together. Advantages and disadvantages. We talked about co-location and being an urban environment, those kind of things. Then we did a combined study. We said, what if we put these two buildings together, public, secure side, future expansion. We were really being challenged by future expansion in this one as far as housing. As we looked at this, there's some challenges, but we could separate the two buildings through this area, how we treat this area, and again, they could be designed completely different. Even though they're attached, we could certainly manage the attachment through how we deal with this area, and that could be a berm, it could be landscaping, it could be fencing, it could be different components that come together. There's a lot of ways architecturally to make these buildings separate, even though you're sharing some common space. Advantages and disadvantages, we kind of run through. If you co-locate, disadvantages are even augmented sometimes when you're in a combined facility. Okay, today we're going to look at the existing jail. That's the first one we'll look at. We'll gather around over here. We have our blocks and we'll do our exercise, the same thing we did last time. So here's the existing jail, and I think the sheriff has done a really great job describing the deficiencies, and I don't think there's any argument what those are. This is the Hall of Justice, some additional parking. And we've done a study on this previously. The commissioners asked us to do a study. So the initial study we did suggested, okay, let's renovate, again, keeping construction costs down, This option suggested renovate the existing jail to maximize the number of beds you can have in there. So it's basically gutted down the structure and then put in all of the ACA, Michigan standards, get all the jails up to standards, refresh the whole environment, make it humane, which we heard is almost unhumane in some previous discussions. And then do an addition in the current parking area. So the first floor addition would be a lot of support spaces, like expanding the kitchen, intake and processing, those kinds of things. Medical, video visitation, and then we would use cell pods on top of that. This is a 4-story building with a basement, so basically, instead of having 2 cell pod blocks, as we showed in our ideal plan, picture cutting one of those in half and then stacking them floor high or 2 high. So we wouldn't need to build as many beds, but when we did a staffing analysis of this, we were adding a lot more staff to it. And for those of you who don't know, the staffing is a big part of the overall operational budget of a jail. It's probably the largest part, one of the largest part of the jail. So if we had inefficient staffing, you're going to live with that forever. And it'll greatly increase the operational budget on a yearly basis. So one of the goals is to maximize the efficiency of the staffing when we do a design. So when we did this design, yeah, it might have saved a little bit on the construction, but in the life cycle, it's going to cost the taxpayers a lot more money because of the additional staffing we had to add. So we were stacking the pods again, very similar to what we had talked about yesterday, and what we showed some images where we had control station, day rooms, 2 stories. We have the first level day room, and then you have a mezzanine above it. And then we would have another series of blocks on top of that. So it'd basically be 4, almost 5-story. Okay, so why don't we take a minute and run through some scenarios on this jail option. This is the participation. Everybody's moving slower today, aren't we? Okay, so as I mentioned, we originally did a study where we were building into this parking space, and there were overlapping hall adjustments, and it was very staff efficient. So the life cycle cost of this thing is going to go up a lot. We save a little bit of money. We're taking, I don't know if you folks have been here on court day, but it's not. I mean, this whole area parking-wise is challenged anyway. To take away from that parking may not be a good idea. So let's explore, what if we did this? What if we did that? And we, similar to the concept before, we put our support components down on the first level. So we take advantage possibly of what's there, but let's say we don't. At least for our intake and processing center. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that when we revised the program yesterday, this block actually got a little bit smaller. So what I'm showing you now is a little bit bigger than what we actually have to work with. So we know we need some medical down here. We have a kitchen that we need to provide for. Yeah, well, we have a kitchen that we're going to provide for. We have other services that we're going to use
like we're going to do mechanical systems, improve mechanical systems. We wanted the corrections administration next to our intake and booking area, which was one of the goals. So let's say we do that. Now, we know we need to build 2 cell pods. So let's say we do that. So what we've done is we're saying we build over this, we don't infringe on this, we have our support services possibly on the first level and expanding out. We probably acquire the property up to this alley, essentially. We put our housing pods there, and then we renovate the upper floors. Well, we cantilever this out. And we renovate our upper floors for the other components that we need. Visitation center may actually be down. Let's say we do this. And then we do something like that. Now there's this scenario that we don't compromise this. We take advantage of existing jail. We maximize our staff efficiency. We acquire a little bit of property, shut this street down, potentially expand parking into this area.
What's the future build-up capabilities of parking lots?
Well,
This way, can you come this
All
way?
still up.
that's one option.
Can you make a bridge over Pine Street? And have
Well, I think we'll explore this option too and see how the two connect. And we may put a component over there. So this is one scenario, guys. Any thoughts?
That's fairly radical.
Well, and then we could just put the juvenile center on top.
Might as well just keep building.
Is it hard to add on later going up?
It can be challenging. You can build the structure. It can be challenging. Yeah. And it's a lot more expensive. It's very expensive. But a future option may be, something like this, and you connect the two together.
As you go up, though, more staff intensive, right? Or go up with the health. Sort of the same bubble.
You're welcome.
You want to do the addition right on top of this too? How do you get that?
Well, that's like I said, basically, it's got it wall to wall.
I think what you would do is you would build the housing first. You would build the housing and these support components first, like the kitchen and the medical and that kind of stuff. So that stays operational. And then you would come in and you would gut the levels where you had the housing and turn it into administration space. Move those folks down, and then you got the levels where the administration space is, improve that, and move them back into those spaces. So you would sequence construction so that you don't compromise your operation. It'd be a little challenging. It'd be noisy, and yeah. So there's things that you have to work through, but that's one scenario. Now let's do another one. As far as another expansion option. And these blocks can be, you know, whatever level makes sense. Now, this one didn't necessarily explore the juvenile center on this site. So let's say we do that real quick. Let's see if I can remember how this all goes together. I'm going to say, let's say that we're going to take this parking and we're going to buy that entire property, and this parking goes over to here. So I create parking around this perimeter. So if we do that, can we fit a juvenile center in here? So I'm going to have some parking directly associated with that. So I know I can't be right on the street. Okay? So we potentially could fit a juvenile center on this site. Now, we would probably crowd the edges so we get future housing. So there is some room for expansion, but not a lot. We could still add some beds back here. We could still expand this. Which means that we're back to this kind of, potentially this kind of scenario for, or we're like this. Oh, you guys are so excited about this, aren't you?
Do you think there'd be room for outdoor recreation for the transition center?
We would be very challenged for that. We would probably do it here and here, but then when you do future expansion, then you're maybe talking about acquiring property and closing another street.
Is that assuming that we don't have functioning kitchens?
And now, we could do it both ways. This suggests that we're shared. So if we want to be completely separate, then we go to this block. So there's still room for some outdoor space. You know, again, you're dealing with these quadrants.
How likely is it though that Burger King and some of these other people are going to be willing to give up their spaces?
We haven't approached anybody on that. We haven't
That would be
approached anybody on the
expensive, I
street.
would think.
And we don't really know what's in the street, Bob. Do you know anything about that? I'm sure there's utilities there.
Walton Street's full of, stuff. In fact, one of the sewer lines is in Walton Street.
Disadvantage. Okay, so we just went through a jail. Now this could be just a juvenile center. And we went through the co-location. We couldn't, I don't think it's feasible to look at an option of combining them together. Do a combination of juvenile and jail. So let's say, what are the advantages to this site? The advantages would be is we could take advantage of the existing tunnel and transportation, reduce the sheriff's costs and things of that related to transporting to courts, these detainees. Is there any advantage to the juvenile center being here?
we're very close to the courthouse.
Same thing.
Centrally located to your service area, your providers, those kind of things. The downside is that I've got a lot of land, expensive land acquisition. I've got utility relocation. I've got a major renovation and all the challenges of renovating and staying operational. I've got higher cost of construction to try to manage that. I got a longer duration. I've got multiple phases of construction rather than just new construction, so I got longer duration, which typically costs more because that contractor, the CM, everyone has overhead conditions that are based on duration. I have challenges expanding this. I have challenges expanding that and providing all the program components like outdoor recreation and things like that you need. I have to displace and then I have to replace. That means I may be all the way down there for parking. Because if I take up all of this, then that parking is going to go all the way down probably the other side of West Muskegon Avenue, or east, west. Or over here. But I've got to reconstruct a parking lot that I'm vacating. So that's,
How do you do the natural light on the side that's shared?
well, what we would do with this is we would do skylights. And the shared side, that's where we put some of the recreations, program spaces and things like that don't need natural light. So we would take advantage of the cells around these sides and we put our program recreation space in here and probably use skylights to support that. So when we abut next to a program like that, the cells go around the perimeter.
And regarding the outdoor recreation component in the jail, that requirement, how is that addressed in this arrangement?
Well, what they do a lot of times is that they'll have an outdoor recreation up here that's actually caged or enclosed, so you still get a lot of natural sunlight, and that they would bring the lower level, this first tier folks up to that. Or we could do it here and have the openable door that we talked about. So we could do one here and they could open that up so they could have outdoor recreation with visibility out in that way, and we could have a cage component potentially on the upper level. So there's a couple different ways we could do, I guess it'd be probably over in here more. So there's a couple different ways we could do that. Anybody like this?
Not a surprise.
What if we were gonna put the yellow blocks on this side of Ninth Street, we were considering that a little bit?
We all need that.
And then we're gonna save this parking lot and try to find another site for this.
We'll look at other sites, yeah, but this is just one scenario. If it's co-located,
Very necessary for the clients to be close to the courthouse and the jail. But the juveniles can be remote a little bit and be broadcast in,
that's right.
not as dangerous. Your impression?
You'd be surprised.
Aaron, you were to quote this.
I have one other question.
Uh-huh.
Is it at all reasonable, I mean, understanding the utility line and the Walton and all, and the use of that street right now, is it possible to preserve that street and build an attachment that goes over the street to, move these pods just a little further?
It would be a lot more expensive than replacing all those utilities. That gets really expensive, the structure of it. Because you're doing a bunch of point loads down, so you're a lot deeper. The soil up here doesn't have a great carrying capacity. So then you're taking all that load and putting it on points rather than spreading out and distributing it. And then when you're driving underneath the structure, you got a different rating for that. So it would be cheaper to relocate the utilities than it would be to build over the top of it.
As cheap as that would be.
I think there's too much close pedestrian traffic.
Well, you would probably find yourself buying to this alley, and we would probably fence that whole perimeter fence. You know, certainly we'd have a lot more control and cost in that control. We'd have a lot more in fencing, so we have a higher cost of security, perimeter security. Yeah. Cameras, CCTV, those kind of things.
We have that now, we should see what we see.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so, any other thoughts on this option?
We'll review what's written up here and then see if we need to add in there.
Yeah, go for it, go for it.
So far, the advantage is we just have centrally located. The sun work. That's one item. And then disadvantages, utility infrastructure along Walton. If we need to relocate any of that, that would be extremely expensive. Keeping things in operation while we're renovating. There's high cost for acquisition. There are expansion challenges, parking relocation and parking challenges for the juvenile transition center, outdoor rec and housing expansion challenges if we were to be on that site. And then there's additional perimeter security costs just because of the nature of the site.
You might put on,
Staffing costs for the jail too. 'Cause you
well,
lose-
it'd be lower staffing compared to the initial
Right, it's
option.
higher than other options.
No. The staffing wouldn't necessarily be higher because we still have one control room around a central pod. Now, if we tried to use their linear in conjunction with the pod, that's where the staffing went way up. So taking all of that housing outside the existing jail configuration, we'd have about the same staffing.
I would say it may or may not be exactly the same, but it will approximate it. And, after we do some layouts, we can look at it, but.
So you're talking about abandoning all the existing housing units?
Yes.
Including the one that's based on the courthouse?
What we would,
That would be holding the court.
pull all the new housing out so you make it as efficient as possible, and then repurpose all the existing space into some other function, a softer function.
Okay, you've heard us mention, or you may not have heard us talk about the Roundy's building. Do you remember how many square foot that was, Joe?
It's like 185,
193, I think.
212, it's 212,000.
212,000 square feet. There's a section of it that we would probably tear down, but we're still over 200,000 square feet. If you remember, our entire program for everybody was 195,000 square feet. So this existing building, and one thing to keep in mind is that an existing building renovation is typically more cost effective than new construction. So let's rotate this a little bit more. Okay, so this is the existing building. It's got, Joe, you've been in there. Can you tell them a little bit about the?
Yeah, it's probably basically 3 or 4 different buildings. The newest section here that's got the number on it, 006400. That's the newest section of the building. But for the most part, the building generally has 32-foot ceiling heights in it throughout, with the exception of the very front, which is where some of the offices were, the oldest section of the building. So from a consideration from a jail standpoint, where we're stacking cells on top of one another, and we need recreation areas with tall ceilings, this thing is it's very flexible, that we can put most anything, most anywhere in the building. The other thing that's nice about this building, we looked at several existing buildings, but one thing that was nice about this one is the column base spacing. The distance between the columns in this is between 45 and 50 feet on center, which those are great, nice spans, as opposed to a lot of industrial buildings, especially the older ones, might be anywhere from 25 to 30. You've got a lot more columns. So the large column base spacing was a lot easier to plan on how do we fit cells around, you know, that podular design we showed you. How can we put these in this building? And with the wide column spacing, it actually works out fairly cleanly.
Okay, now, again, on this option, we had been asked, or we had explored it a little bit before. And what could happen. Now, there's certain things we may need to add, such as a sally port, which is really cost-effective space anyway. So, for instance, the juvenile center program is 36,000 square feet. We have 66,000 square feet when we lay out the entire jail that we're not using in this building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, let's do some blocks and kind of see how this works out. Now, use more rectilinear. So what this suggests is that we had our housing pods here. And then we had an intake center. Now again, keep in mind that this block is a little bit larger. But we had an intake center over here, which imagine a sally port in that area. And then we basically put our service on this side. So let's just go ahead and put some of that in there. We decided we wanted our medical and our correctional somewhat related to our intake and processing.